I can only remember one thing, sad to say, about somebody I met a long time ago, and it was his abhorrent statement that the Jews experienced the Holocaust because they rejected Jesus Christ. I just cringed to hear that. There was a great chasm that opened up between us. The man made his statement so coolly and calmly, with an unfeeling, deadly certainty. As he spoke, his appearance was robotic, machine-like. I pictured an SS man standing there before me, a scary, creepy kind of guy. Well, something in him, I think, had been locked up and forgotten, and I believe that was his heart, which had been lost somewhere along the way. He was all brain, all head, no feeling, no compassion, only cold certitude. Well, I believe this poor man was living in William Blake's land of Urizen, Urizen, where the cold, confining spirit lives a barren, antarctic existence. Blake called this density, this lowest level of consciousness, a kind of impenetrable thickness. He called it a self-enclosed and all-repelling state to be in. He wrote of it as petrifying all human imagination into rock and sand, and he called it my vision's greatest enemy. Where this dense level of consciousness exists, there is no heat, there is no light, there's no warmth. Why? Because for Blake, this is a level of narrowed perceptions. As he expressed it poetically, the eye of man a little narrow orb, closed up and dark, scarcely beholding the great light, conversing with the ground. The ear a little shell, in small volutions, shutting out true harmonies, and comprehending great as small. So William Blake, the great English poet, is describing a chilly state of diminished consciousness. I recall in my innocent enthusiasm a number of years ago as a young clergyman presenting the ideas of Colin Wilson to a group of clergy and business executives at a church board meeting. I was hoping to raise the temperature a little by a reference to Colin Wilson's ideas about heat creating, heat generating levels of consciousness. I discovered Colin Wilson's book, The Outsider, when I had just been walking out of a bookstore in downtown Vancouver, and I glanced back and I saw this title, The Outsider, and I was intrigued by that title. I thought, what's that about? And when I read it, it gripped me very wonderfully. And I'd always been wanting to share Colin Wilson's ideas, like this is an inspired human being. Well, at the church board meeting, it soon became a meat freezer as I began to share Colin's ideas. Nobody was interested. Nobody was the slightest bit interested. And one guy shot me down immediately by saying, why would we want to hear about him? Why would we want to hear about that? And I don't think he liked that word, consciousness. Well, several years later, I noticed that several of my Colin Wilson books had mysteriously vanished from my home library, and I had no idea where they'd gone. It took a while for me to realize that my eldest son, who had been known quite often in high school in a rather debased and pathetic way, he used to say that he had never read a book. Well, the boy was devouring the books of Colin Wilson in his basement bedroom. I had never been so happy in my life to have been robbed. That boy, with his newly acquired taste for deep reading, then went on a trip to England, arranged to meet the great author, Colin Wilson, the author of more than 80 books on raising levels of consciousness. Now, I don't know how Jeremy pulled it off, but he did. And apparently upon arrival, he and Colin went on a walk around a lake near his home. That went so well that Colin and his wife invited Jeremy for dinner. That went so well that they invited him to stay the night. Well, the church board members didn't want to hear anything about Wilson. I'd failed to connect with them. But my son, in contrast, had caught Wilson's spirit, and that heat of deep inquiry that Wilson encourages crossed the ocean to spend an unforgettable time with the great author, with this inspired and gracious man. My son felt that heat, and it's been something that has been shared between us ever since. Well, Robert Bly, the great American poet, has long been a lover of the poetry of William Blake. And he has said in his effort to bring alive the ideas of Blake that when consciousness changes, like when there are shifts of consciousness, there's heat is always generated. At the lowest levels of consciousness, well, it's cold down there, as I said. The molecules aren't moving. There is a poverty of spirit. And Bly himself confesses that when he was a college student, he lived on that level of trapped energy when the imagination is frozen. He calls it a level of blindness and says about it, you only see what is there. You only see what is there. Quoting from Blake, one looks at a sunset and makes the comment that it resembles a guinea piece. Or if we make this contemporary, someone sees a sunset and exclaims that she's reminded of a postcard she saw once. Well, gasp, this is a pretty low level of and dismal level of awareness. William Blake, in contrast, when he beheld the sunset, he saw a host of angels singing hallelujah. And in a similar way, Colin Wilson writes, when I open my eyes in the morning, I'm not confronted by a world, but by a million possible worlds. So this is a small and unimaginary world, this dense level of consciousness. As Bly says, you only see what's there, no heat is generated. A little heat begins to be generated as you move out of that dense level into a little bit of a higher level when the heart opens towards human beings, towards respecting other human beings as unique and different. The heat arises because you respect them and you're listening to them. The heat arises from separate beings coming together and interacting, but not losing their particular identities. Like, it's just great to be distinct and unique. So it's suggested that when you approach someone, this is Bly trying to bring alive William Blake's ideas, when you approach someone, you want to make contact with another human being, you respect that person by asking her a question and then listening. Well, what a novel idea. Ask a question and then listen with your whole heart. Again, respecting her uniqueness. You don't begin with a pronouncement of some kind, but with a question. So the way to talk is not to talk. Heat is generated when deep listening is shared. So let me illustrate this. I love to go to Trader Joe's. It's just over the border in Washington State. It's a little grocery store. It has lots of great stuff. But one day I had a not so hot experience at Trader Joe's. I'd been searching for the men's washroom, and I walked past a line of women who had been waiting, I presumed, to get into theirs. I couldn't find the men's washroom, and I began to panic a little. A woman, noticing my plight, a woman in that line, was kind of harshly, a little bit rudely, said, "The line is here," beckoning me to the back of the line. Well, I didn't understand quite what was going on. Her manner was disturbing. And then I realized that what was happening is these group of women were all waiting to get into what looked to me like sort of a Soviet-style unisex washroom, like, oh, joy. And then from this group of enlightened beings, there arose this chorus of unpleasant voices, all kind of together in a shrill way, talking about their dream of unisex, everything. Well, I tell you, it was a little bit disturbing, and I got the message loud and clear that I was expected to conform to their vision of a common washroom. You stand in line here. My response was, well, I quickly decided that I didn't have to go to the washroom so badly. And then rather, as I imagined, squatting down amongst them in their sacred abode, I bolted for the door. It felt a little like a taste of fascism at Trader Joe's, very icy and cold, and I pictured these gals in gray uniforms goose-stepping. There was no respect for me as a somewhat older gentleman who'd not become enlightened enough to enter their new age of no gender differences. So what I'm saying here is that Robert Bly, re-expressing William Blake's ideas, is trying to say that heat is generated when differences are respected, like male and female, night and day, all these dichotomies. You don't blur them. You let them be what they are. And then out of the strength of particular identities, a creative tension occurs between them as they interact. Bly then moves from that, we've gone from that coldest level of consciousness to a level of generation. And now we move to higher levels that he called Beulah and Eden. And I'm going to move right into Eden, which is the highest state, and make mention of when Robert Bly, ran a workshop and asked the students what they thought the highest level of consciousness might be. And interestingly enough, they had absorbed, obviously, from the culture 2 particular words to indicate the highest state. You know what these were? One was to be in a detached state, and the other word was transcendence. Detachment and transcendence. So Bly, after getting their response, then presented to them the idea of Blake that the highest state wasn't so much transcendence, but rather, or detachment, but rather was to be in a state of being creative, to be continually creative. Like you think in the beginning, God created. Our task now is to be, and be like him, to be creative. And it appears, this is quite wonderful, that Blake not only preached that, but he lived it to the end of his days. As G.K. Chesterton says in his wonderful little book on Blake, his last sickness fell upon him very slowly, and he does not seem to have taken much notice of it. He continued perpetually his pictorial designs, and one of the last designs he made was one of the strongest he made. I mean, think of this. He's in a weakened condition, he's close to death, and he creates the strongest design he's ever created. And it was the tremendous image of the Almighty bending forward, foreshortened in a colossal perspective to trace out the heavens with a compass. This is pretty wonderful. So if we're asking where the heat is, well, if you relate to William Blake here, Blake is saying that the heat will be where creativity is occurring. Where's the heat? When any of us is living as an exuberant soul, glowing with health and energy. When any of us is living as an exuberant soul, glowing with health and energy.